You've seen it. And if you haven't seen it, you've definitely at least heard of it. Unlike my last essay, which was about a movie you'd never heard of, The Prince of Egypt is no hidden gem. Widely regarded as a masterpiece, and rightfully so, to this day it's a breathtaking spectacle in every aspect of its presentation, from sight to sound. The Prince of Egypt is an animated musical based on the story of Exodus that was released by DreamWorks in 1998, with the musical music done by Steven Schwartz and the score music done by Hans Zimmer. The music is breathtaking and impeccably performed, particularly by the late great Ofra Haza in the opening track, who personally recorded her own vocals in all 10 million languages the music was translated into, including Hebrew, which for obvious reasons is the most emotionally powerful version of the score. The attention to detail paid by the people who worked on The Prince of Egypt is noted in many articles about its production. The artists paid attention to how they could differentiate this more serious undertaking from the kinds of animated films released by the then reigning champion of animated movies, Disney. According to various online sources, Jeffrey Katzenberg visited with, quote, about 700 Bible scholars, Egyptologists, divinity school teachers, and religious leaders, and while I couldn't find an exhaustive list, specific mention was made in several places of both the dean and founder of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Orthodox Rabbi Marvin Heyer, as well as legendary shithead Jerry Falwell Sr., so, you know, they talked to everybody. Considering how the movie came out, it's safe to say that the team took many different perspectives into account to at least try to ensure that none of the different faiths who felt that their personal histories were tied to the story were left feeling that things were done improperly. I first saw The Prince of Egypt when I was a kid. I, the daughter of one of my mom's coworkers, and my older sister went to see it at a really cheap theater near my house that was on the verge of shutting down. The projector broke down several times during the showing, and honestly, I actually can't remember whether we finished the movie or had to leave because they couldn't keep the projector working. So naturally, I didn't develop a proper appreciation for this movie until a few years later when we got it on VHS, and I proceeded to watch it about 100,000 times. In college, since for a while Netflix had the entire DreamWorks catalog, there was a period of a few months where I watched it at least once a week. It's a story that's larger than life, presented by masters of their craft, and it's a pleasure to rewatch whenever I make the time to do it. But, of course, no adaptation is one-to-one with its source material, and The Prince of Egypt is no exception. There are plenty of reasons for an adaptation of a written source to differ from what it's based on. There's the time constraints of cinema, the vagueness or over-specificity of the source material, or the screenwriter just wanted to do something different, and so on. In the case of The Prince of Egypt, what DreamWorks aimed to do was capture the essence and spirit of the Exodus story, but present it in a way that was cinematically cohesive and emotionally engaging. Because of that, there are a lot of things that were changed from book to screen, as it were. Some of these changes are small, and some of them are pretty huge. The question of what book The Prince of Egypt is based on is both more simple and more complicated than it appears. The film calls itself an adaptation of the Exodus story, but makes a key concession when it refers to this as a biblical story further down the same screen. This is both true and not quite true. Now, I'm not a theologian, and I'm not an expert on this topic, nor is this video intended to be a history lesson in anything. But for the sake of arguments I'll be making later on, there's an important series of distinctions I want to make here. The Book of Exodus is the second book of the Bible, contained within the half that I grew up knowing as the Old Testament. If you wanted to be accurate about what you called this half of the book when removed from the context of the Christian Bible as a whole, you might call it the Hebrew Bible. But if you wanted to be a stickler, you'd call it the Tanakh. Exodus is the second book of the Tanakh, part of the 5-book section called the Torah, where it's called Shemot. Shemot? Shemot? Shemot?
Shemot.
Shemot?
Shemot.
I did the best I could. So, if you want the most accurate version of this story, then unless you go back even further to the text that the Tanakh itself was assembled from, then the Tanakh, from which the Old Testament was translated, is it. But here's the thing, the Tanakh obviously is in Hebrew, with a few disparate sections in Aramaic. Anything else is a translation, and translations are never perfect. Because of the phrasing used here, we can assume that DreamWorks didn't use the Tanakh as their source material. They used the Bible, presumably in English, and there's nothing about which version or translation of the Bible they used, some of which differ greatly even between each other, not to mention all the differences that they have from their original source material. So why did I just tell you all that? Why does it matter? Well, to be fair, it's entirely possible that it actually doesn't. I can't read Hebrew, so I've never read the Tanakh in its original language, nor have I read any translation of it that wasn't branded as the Old Testament. This video is looking at The Prince of Egypt as a movie adaptation of a book, just like this or this, but as an adaptation of this book, not this one. If, during the course of my arguments, I raise points that are the result of a difference in translation or interpretation between the Tanakh and the Old Testament, I want to make it clear that those are differences that existed before I ever made this video, and not the result of any deliberate misinterpretation of the Tanakh on my part. Now, I don't mean to be disingenuous when I point any of this out. Let's be really clear here. The story that the Prince of Egypt comes from is unambiguously a Jewish story, being quite literally about the exodus of the Hebrew people from Egypt. Jeffrey Katzenberg, Steven Spielberg, and David Geffen, the three founders of DreamWorks, are all Jewish men, and Katzenberg was the lead on the Prince of Egypt as a project. While I didn't do any research into whether Jeffrey Katzenberg practices or self-identifies as Jewish, because frankly that's not any of my business, he and the others would obviously have been aware of the Jewish nature of the story they were telling, but the story as presented in the film self-identifies as being a biblical story. The term biblical is perhaps intentionally a little vague, allowing viewers of different faiths to insert their own scripture in its place, but it would be disingenuous to ignore the fact that the term is generally regarded as referring specifically to the Christian Bible, and it's from that specific perspective that the rest of this analysis follows. Finally, before we get into the meat of things, one final disclaimer. Because some people might believe it matters, considering this is an explicitly religious story, here's an acknowledgement of what you might consider to be my personal biases. I was raised deeply religious in my youth. We went to church every Sunday, we had at-home family Bible study once a week, and my siblings and I attended a private Christian school until varying ages. I personally left that school around age 14, though I'd started having doubts a few years earlier, and now as an adult I've been a not applicable on the which religion are you form for far longer than I was ever any of the other options. That said, my intention with this video is not to criticize any of the faiths associated with the Exodus story, or even to criticize the story itself. I love The Prince of Egypt, it's one hell of a story, and I wouldn't hesitate to label it as my favorite animated film of all time. While I don't doubt that being religious, specifically Jewish, makes The Prince of Egypt hit differently, I don't think you need to be religious to appreciate the story in general. Sometimes a good story well told is enough, at least for me. The Prince of Egypt is a work of art. All of which is to say, looking at The Prince of Egypt as the film adaptation of a book, and nothing more, what could we glean from the ways in which it's different from its source material? And, more importantly, does looking at the source material change your perspective about the events themselves as they're portrayed? The title of the video already gave away where I'm going with this, but now it's time to get into the why. Boiled down to its bare essentials, The Prince of Egypt is, like many other movies before it, a movie adapted from a book. The film's framing makes mention of the Torah and the Quran in only one place. Here, after all the credits, with a single verse from each, along with a verse from the Bible. So in this case, as we've said, the source material is the Book of Exodus, chapters 1 through 15. As with any adaptation, various things have been changed, added, or left out entirely for the sake of telling a good, cohesive story in the time allotted, and to an audience that may very well be unfamiliar with the source material. Now, the book is pretty vague sometimes with its description of events, so you can hardly fault DreamWorks for filling in the blanks for the sake of telling a story that makes narrative sense. That said, there are a great number of things that are explicitly different from the book, and we'll go over them now for 3 reasons. First, to illustrate just how many things were changed, and in what ways they were changed, will help me draw attention to the point of the video. Second, one of these changes in particular is the most important change we'll discuss, and having the context of all the other changes will be a good backdrop. Third, I thought it was interesting to go through Exodus and make note of these differences, and if I don't show my work then I spent 3 hours cataloging them all for nothing, and I refuse to let that be the case. In the interest of full transparency, a note. I'll be using 2 Bibles today. These Bibles, in fact. One is the tried and true King James version, which has stood the test of time, in my opinion primarily because all those these and thous make God sound very dramatic. The other is what's called the Revised Standard Version, or sometimes the Revised Standard Edition, with this specific edition first published in 1962. The King James Version, while undoubtedly the most famous edition of the Bible that exists and is still in common use, is nonetheless plagued with issues that the Revised Standard Version seeks to fix. The preface goes over this in detail, but the gist of it is that the language is archaic and often hard to understand, the source texts used have since been supplanted by older and presumably more accurate source texts, and the translations from Hebrew were, for various reasons, often performed inaccurately. The Revised Standard Version has actually come under quite a bit of fire, with biblical scholar Daniel B. Wallace even referring to it as, quote, the most hated English translation of all time. It's been criticized for allegedly adhering to a Jewish viewpoint, specifically because its translation of the Old Testament has been perceived as agreeing with the Jewish Publication Society of America's translation of the Tanakh, which was the first translation of the Tanakh into English that was performed by a committee, though not the first translation into English overall. I'm not here to go into detail about the merit or lack thereof of any of these arguments, since that's not what this video is about. I bring it up only to say that I'm aware of the controversy, but since it stems from considering the RSV to be too Jewish, and as we've discussed, the story behind the Prince of Egypt is a story by the Jewish people about the Jewish people, I hardly think using a Bible translation criticized for being too Jewish is really going to be a problem. So, in the film, Moses is found by Pharaoh's wife. In the book, Moses is found by Pharaoh's daughter. In the film, after setting Moses adrift in the basket, Yocheved never sees him again. In the book, after Moses is found by Pharaoh's daughter, his sister Miriam offers to find her a nursemaid from the Israelites to nurse baby Moses, and actually gets Yocheved to do this job. She raises and nurses him, receiving wages for being his nursemaid until he grew up, but it's not really clear how long that takes. In the film, Moses and Rameses, the Pharaoh's biological son, are raised as brothers, and Moses has no idea that he's actually Hebrew. In the book, there's no indication that Moses and any of Pharaoh's children were raised as siblings. In fact, Rameses as a name is only mentioned as the name of what's called a store city, and none of Pharaoh's children are ever named or referenced in any way. Moses knows from the outset that he's a Hebrew, and there's no indication that this was ever kept from him. In the film, after learning of his heritage from Miriam and having this information confirmed by his mother, Moses begins to feel sympathy for the slaves, and accidentally kills an Egyptian slave driver in defense of an old Hebrew man. In the book, Moses, always having known of his heritage, kills an Egyptian who is beating a Hebrew. In the film, facing this accidental killing and the new knowledge that he's a Hebrew and not an Egyptian, Moses immediately flees the city despite Rameses telling him that he can declare him innocent. In the book, the day after Moses has killed the Egyptian who was beating the Hebrew, he interrupts two fighting Hebrews and one of them basically says, "What are you gonna do, kill me like you killed that other guy?" Realizing his crime is known to them and thus probably is also known to the Pharaoh, who will definitely want to punish him, Moses flees. The Pharaoh, upon learning what Moses did, does indeed order his death. In the film, after driving the shepherds away and helping Jethro's daughters draw water from the well, Zipporah sees Moses and, remembering his treatment of her when she was briefly a prisoner in Egypt, drops him in the well. Moses decides to stay with them, and eventually they fall in love and get married. In the book, Zipporah's capture never happened. After driving away the shepherds and helping Jethro's daughters draw water from the well, Jethro tells them to go get Moses and they welcome him to the tribe. Moses decides to stay, and Jethro gives Zipporah to Moses as his wife. In the film, there's a montage of undetermined length where Moses gets used to his new life and settles into being a husband. Moses and Zipporah have no children during this time. In the book, Moses and Zipporah have a son named Gershom, and other sons between Gershom and when Moses returns to Egypt. In the film, when talking to the burning bush, Moses says he'll never be able to convince the Hebrews to follow him. God says he'll tell Moses the right things to say. In the book, Moses says the Israelites will never believe that God appeared to him and will call him a liar. God turns Moses' staff into a snake and back, and gives his hand leprosy and then cures it. Moses is instructed to reproduce these wonders to help convince the Hebrews that he was sent as God's messenger, and if they still don't believe him after these two things, he should get some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, which will turn that water into blood. In the film, Moses questions his place as God's chosen messenger because he was treated as the son of the Pharaoh, who ordered the slaying of their children and maintained their enslavement. God responds,
"Who made man's mouth? Who made the deaf, the mute, the seeing, or the blind? Did not I? Now..."
Moses is convinced, and that's the end of the conversation. In the book, Moses, not having been raised as Pharaoh's son, nor having been unaware of his heritage as a Hebrew, questions his place as God's chosen messenger because he's not a convincing or an eloquent speaker. God responds, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him dumb or deaf, or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth, and teach you what you shall speak." Moses still insists that he's the wrong guy for the job. God gets annoyed and basically goes, "Fine, go get your brother Aaron once you're back in Egypt, and I'll tell you what to tell him to say, and he'll be happy to see you when you get there." In the film, Zipporah is reluctant to let Moses go to Egypt, but eventually resolves to go with him. In the book, God decides to kill Moses, I think, or his son? I'm not really sure because of the wording, but then Zipporah does a whole thing with circumcising their son and calling Moses a bridegroom of blood to her. She doesn't appear to go to Egypt with Moses, and God deciding out of nowhere to kill Moses, or maybe his son, is never mentioned again. In the film, Moses and Zipporah go straight through the desert to Rameses, who is now the Pharaoh. In the book, God tells Aaron to go out and meet Moses by a mountain. He does, and he's happy to see him. Aaron takes Moses to the elders of the Israelites. Aaron says everything Moses told him to say, and performs the signs God had prepared to convince the Hebrews of the truth of the message. They're convinced. In the film, Moses, after reuniting with his adoptive brother Rameses, delivers the message. God commands he let my people go, the implication being free the Hebrews from slavery. Rameses is incredulous at the idea of being commanded to do anything. In the book, Moses and Aaron go to the Pharaoh together and deliver the message. God commands that he let the Hebrews go into the wilderness for 3 days to hold a feast in God's honor. Pharaoh says this god is not a god he knows nor one he cares about, and accuses Moses of inciting the slaves to laziness. In the film, to convince Rameses, Moses turns his staff into a snake to, quote, behold the power of God. The court magicians, through sleight of hand, appear to do the same, though the implication is that they faked it with literal smoke and mirrors. Moses' serpent eats the other two, but Rameses isn't convinced. In the book, this exchange doesn't happen here. It happens a while later, after stuff that was shuffled around for the movie. When it does happen, Aaron is the one who sets down the staff and turns it into a serpent. The court magicians again replicate this act, though it's implied that they did it for real with secret arts. Aaron's serpent eats the other serpents, but again, Pharaoh isn't convinced. In the film, Rameses and Moses go off to speak alone. Saddened by Moses' reassertion that he did indeed return only to free the Hebrews from slavery, Rameses angrily rebukes him, refuses to free them, and doubles their workload. In the book, Pharaoh, accusing Moses of causing the slaves to slack off, tells the slave drivers to make them gather their own straw for brickmaking rather than providing it for them, but also clarifies that this increased workload does not permit them to have a decreased output, obviously setting them up for failure, intending for this to break their spirit and make them stop listening to Moses. In the film, one of the Hebrews, angry with the increased workload, slings some mud at Moses as he leaves the temple. Aaron, encountering him for the first time since his return, is not happy to see him, angrily confronts him, and declares that God doesn't care about the Hebrews, and Moses didn't care about the slaves until he learned he himself was a Hebrew. Miriam tells Aaron to chill out and reaffirms her faith in Moses as a messenger and deliverer. Moses immediately goes out to confront Pharaoh on his leisure boat, the Hebrews following him to watch. In the book, the Hebrews confront Aaron and Moses as they leave the temple, asking why they brought this burden down on them all. Moses confronts God and asks why he sent them to demand freedom only to have the Pharaoh make things worse while God didn't help. God says he's totally helping going forward. Aaron and Moses return to the Pharaoh and the whole snake thing goes down. After this fails to convince him, God tells them to go out to the river the next morning and wait for Pharaoh to come out. In the film, Moses again commands for Rameses to free the Hebrews. Rameses says no and sends guards to bring Moses to him. Moses sticks his staff into the river, turning the water into blood. In the book, Moses and Aaron wait by the riverside for Pharaoh to come out, and when he does, Aaron immediately sticks the staff into the river, turning it to blood and killing all the fish. In the film, the court magicians again replicate the effect, although again they're shown to be faking it through sleight of hand and some tropical punch Kool-Aid powder. Rameses tells Moses to give up. Moses refuses. In the book, the court magicians again replicate the effect, though again the implication is that they do it for real by their secret arts. Pharaoh refuses to let the Hebrews go anywhere. In the film, Aaron tells Moses it's hopeless because the sorcerers replicated the effect and Pharaoh still has power over their lives. Moses entreats the Hebrews to hold fast to their faith. In the book, none of that happens. 7 days pass after the river incident, and God tells Moses and Aaron to return to the Pharaoh and tell him to let the Hebrews go, into the wilderness for a feast, or God will send a plague of frogs upon Egypt. In the film, we now have the plagues sequence. This song covers a wide span of time and thus glosses over a few things, but considering the entire thing is a musical number, the primary difference I'm specifically marking out for the start of this sequence is the explicit and clear one. The angst in this number is primarily focused around Rameses not understanding how, in his mind, Moses came to hate and curse him. Moses wishes that God had sent another messenger because he finds no joy in torturing his brother, even if it's to free his people from slavery. He feels bad for the innocent Egyptians suffering on Rameses' behalf. During the penultimate plague, the Plague of Darkness, Moses enters the temple to find Rameses and attempts to convince him one last time. They relive some of their childhood memories and seem on the verge of coming to some kind of agreement when Rameses' son interrupts, and Rameses, perhaps wanting to look strong in front of his family, tells Moses that he will not be dictated to, no matter the cost, and threatens to institute another final purge of the Hebrews, declaring,
"And there shall be a great cry in all of Egypt, such as never has been or ever will be again."
Moses sadly tells Rameses that what will follow is something Rameses brought upon himself. In the book, Moses and Pharaoh are not brothers, so none of this angst about their relationship or the effect of Rameses' refusal on the rest of Egypt is present. They make no attempts to reconcile or relate to one another during or after any of the plagues. After the Plague of Frogs, the court magicians successfully replicate its effects. They're unable to replicate any of the plagues after the frogs, and after the Plague of Lice and Gnats specifically tell Pharaoh that the finger of God is at work, but he doesn't listen. During the plagues of frogs, flies, hail, and locusts, Pharaoh says each time that he will let the Hebrews go, to the wilderness for a feast. They then end the plague, and each time Pharaoh takes back his promise and keeps the Hebrews from leaving. During the other plagues, he never agreed to anything, but the plague ended all the same. Before the Plague of Locusts, Pharaoh agrees to let some of the Hebrews go, to the wilderness for a feast, but when Moses insists that all of the Hebrews be allowed to go as well as their animals, Pharaoh denounces this as a trick and again refuses to let anyone go at all. During the Plague of Darkness, Pharaoh agrees to let all the Hebrews go, to the wilderness for a feast, but insist that they leave their animals. Moses insists that they need to take the animals too, and Pharaoh not only again refuses to let anyone leave at all, he also tells Moses not to come back and demand anything ever again, or he'll be killed. In the film, Moses now instructs the Hebrews about how to mark their doorways so that God will pass them over for this final plague, the death of the firstborn. In the book, not only are the Hebrews instructed to mark their doorways to protect them from the death of the firstborn, but the sequence of events, restrictions, and details for Passover are outlined here. In the film, Moses now returns to Rameses who, grieving over the body of his dead son, tells Moses that the Hebrews are free. Moses tries to comfort him but is told to leave. He sadly does so. Rameses angrily glares at Moses' retreating form. Moses, overcome with grief at what he's been a part of, collapses and sobs outside the temple. Miriam, in song, leads the Hebrews in gathering to leave, lending resolve to Moses so that he can continue to lead them. He does, leading them all out of Egypt en masse, along with a few Egyptians who decide to come along. It's not shown how they know where to go, so the assumption is that God is telling Moses personally where to lead them. In the book, after the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh summons Aaron and Moses to him and commands them to take the Hebrews and leave forever. The Egyptian people themselves give gold and jewelry to the Hebrews and rush them out of Egypt in a hurry. They leave and travel across the desert to the Red Sea. God shows the way with a pillar of clouds during the day and a pillar of fire during the night. No Egyptians are said to have come with them. In the film, they eventually come to the Red Sea. In the book, God specifically tells Moses to turn everyone back the way they came and take a slightly different route, so that they're camping between Baal-Zephon and the sea, so that the Pharaoh considers them trapped between the wilderness and the water. In the film, as they approach the Red Sea to rest, a horn is blown to warn them that Rameses has come with an army, clearly to wipe them out. Understandably freaking out, the Hebrews run toward the sea. The sky darkens, and a pillar of fire shoots out of the water, drawing a wall of fire between Rameses' army and the Hebrews. They turn to Moses for guidance. He remembers, or hears again, God's statement that,
"With this staff you shall do my wonders."
He slams the staff into the water and parts the sea for safe passage. In the book, Pharaoh corners the Hebrews at their camp, and the Hebrews accuse Moses of leading them out here just to die, stating that it would have been better to stay behind and live than to have come all this way just to be killed. Moses tells them not to despair because God will fight for them, and they'll never have to see the Egyptians again. God asks Moses what the hell he's calling out to him for, and to hurry up and just tell the Israelites to approach the sea, lift up his rod, and stretch out his hand to separate the waters. The cloud pillar that had been guiding their way moves from in front of the group to between them and the Egyptians, preventing them from coming any closer while night comes and goes. In the film, as they're crossing but before all the way out, the pillar of fire protecting the Hebrews from the Egyptians goes away, and Rameses furiously leads a charge into the breach. In the book, God, watching from what is now a pillar of fire, clogs the chariot wheels of the Egyptians. Seeing this and realizing that God is on the side of the Hebrews, some of them flee. In the film, everyone, including Rameses, loses control of their horses. Rameses orders the army to charge in on foot and kill them all. With no warning to or input from Moses, the walls of water begin to collapse in on the Egyptians and drown them. The ensuing wave blows Rameses out of the breach and slams him on a slab of rock on the opposite side of the shore, the sole survivor of his army. The Hebrews safely make it out on the other side just before the sea finishes closing back up. In the book, God tells Moses to stretch out his hand again to close the sea behind him, and the water crashes down and kills all the Egyptians while the Hebrews continue walking on the seabed to the opposite shore. The collapsing sea even sucks in the parts of Pharaoh's army that had retreated or never entered the seabed at all, killing every last one, Pharaoh presumably included. In the film, the Hebrews celebrate their narrow but successful escape. Moses thanks Miriam for always believing in him. Then, stepping away from the congratulations, he approaches the edge of the sea. He hears Rameses, alone on the opposite shore, calling his name over and over. Moses sadly says his goodbyes and returns to lead the Hebrews on their path as they sing and celebrate. Zipporah tells Moses to look over at his people. They are free. A time-lapse fast-forwards to Moses returning from Mount Sinai with the stone slabs bearing the 10 Commandments. The end. In the book, the Hebrews, seeing the Egyptians dead on the opposite shore, are renewed in their belief that Moses was sent by God to free them. They sing a song in praise and continue on their journey. After a whole lot of stuff, Moses returns from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments. The end, at least as far as this particular story is concerned. All told, while this list amounts to a pretty hefty catalog of changes, none of these changes are difficult to explain or justify. Moses' kids with Zipporah were deleted or at least pushed off to an unseen epilogue, the sorcerers were changed from genuine practitioners of dark magic to sleight of hand stage magicians, Aaron went through Faramir levels of character assassination, etc. Sure. But none of these changes change the core of the story in any really huge way. It's still the same story, but writ large, simplified and accelerated for the sake of cinema. But there is one change that I didn't go out of my way to point out in that list, and it does change the core of the story. In the movie, when God sends Moses back to Egypt to liberate the Hebrews, he sends him off with this statement.
I shall be with you when you go to the king of Egypt, but Pharaoh will not listen. So I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders.
Note the use of passive voice here. Pharaoh will not listen. Just, because he's a butthole. I have nothing to do with that. I promise. During the sequence in the book, God actually says the following. When you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles which I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart, so that he will not let the people go. Moses apparently doesn't think that that's weird, but true to his word, God does exactly that. He again tells Moses that this is what he's up to a few chapters later in Exodus 7:3, and again, it's not commented on further. In the following chapters, Pharaoh's heart is said to be hardened about a dozen times. Out of this dozen, God is explicitly said to have been responsible for about 10. Because of the way it's phrased in the passive voice these other 6 times, you could read them as being either a conscious decision by the Pharaoh or the interference of God, but Pharaoh is explicitly said to have hardened his own heart of his own accord only 3 times, and one of those times, the verse immediately following, clarifies that God was in fact responsible for that one as well, so, we can recognize a pattern when we see one. None of this is mentioned in the movie. Like many things from the book, it's omitted almost entirely, and the movie proceeds in a universe where God's interference in the Pharaoh's actions is not present. However, in the plagues, Rameses sings,
Then let my heart be hardened, and never mind how high the cost may grow.
And honestly, that's enough of a jumping off point for me. As presented on film, The Prince of Egypt is a story about one man's God-given quest to free his people from slavery, with this pursuit stymied at every turn by his obstinate brother, who refuses to free them even at the cost of his kingdom, his people, and eventually his son. Rameses' unwillingness to, as he sees it, be dictated to or threatened, is set up early with his father accusing him of being a weak link that could bring down their mighty dynasty. A line that Rameses references directly when he again tells Moses that he will not free the Hebrews from slavery. In the book, there is no such echo because Rameses does not exist. There is no indication that the pharaoh Moses entreats is a different pharaoh than the one he fled at the beginning, and honestly, in the book, there's no real need to have specifically noted that it was God that hardened Pharaoh's heart. Events in the Bible are sometimes extraordinarily vague, and characters are often given only surface-level emotions and motivations. It would have been perfectly reasonable for Pharaoh, and thus for Rameses in the adaptation, to refuse to free the Hebrews for no reason beyond simply being evil. But if we, as readers of a book often do, try to watch the movie by reinserting the now unseen, now unspoken context of the source material back into the story, the things that Rameses does take on a very different tone. When Moses and Rameses speak one-on-one, and he asks in earnest for Rameses to free the Hebrews, Rameses seems extraordinarily sad that Moses has only come back to free his people, and not to stay in Egypt as his brother. Then, just when he seems to be on the cusp of making some sort of concession, instead he gets angry, and not only refuses to free the Hebrews, but instead doubles down on their enslavement. His heart, which was by no means soft, but which might have been swayed by the pleas of his brother, is hardened, not of his own accord, but by the hand of a God he does not know. If you want to take this thought a step further, then it's not just that he's forced to make a decision he didn't want to make. It's that he's possessed, inhabited by an angry deity, and forced to watch from behind his own eyes as his body makes decisions without his input that drive away his brother, devastate his people, destroy his empire, and kill his son. And Moses has no idea. He's being manipulated by being led to think that Rameses is being unreasonable out of spite, or anger, or some misplaced sense of righteousness, when what's really going on is that Moses is fighting a war entirely precipitated and orchestrated by the same deity that sent him here in the first place. Why tell Moses to fight to free the Hebrews when you already planned to force the pharaoh to make them stay? Why bring the plagues as punishment for his refusal to free them when he might have already done so had you not forced him not to? Moses begs Rameses to think of his people and reconsider keeping the Hebrews enslaved, but for all we know, he is, and he's just powerless to control his own body and follow through. God tells Moses to bring one devastating plague after another as punishment for things that, on the other side of the veil, God himself is causing to happen. Not through inaction in the "if you're all-knowing then you could have stopped this" kind of way, but directly and actively through clear and active participation in the actions that Rameses does and doesn't take. What kind of deity does something like that? It's horrible. It's Machiavellian. You look like the good guy to one camp, and the other camp, that knows you're not the good guy, is prevented from outing you as a double agent by actions that you yourself are taking. All of this culminates in the final chase through the Red Sea. Rameses, still under the control of an angry god, orders his army to kill every last one of the Hebrews as they charge into the breach. They safely make it out the other side, and God drops the ocean on the Egyptians and wipes out the entire army save for Rameses himself, who's crashed onto a rock on the opposite shore. And then here, now, with whatever nefarious purpose God had for pitting these two sides against one another fulfilled, he leaves Rameses. Finally back in control of his own body, Rameses calls out across the sea for Moses. In the film as presented, the tone of his shouting is ambiguous. Is he angry? Is he sad? But through the lens of a viewing that presents Rameses as merely the puppet of larger powers, it's tragic. Let me explain, Moses, come back. I didn't do any of that. That wasn't me, Moses. It wasn't me. But he has no way to ever tell him, so Moses will never know. Rameses has to return to his destroyed kingdom and face the wrath and suffering of his people, who, as far as they know, have suffered because of him and him alone. And Moses will live his life thinking Rameses hated him to the end, never learning that the suffering on both sides of the conflict was all caused by the actions of one angry god. The same God he thinks is his deliverer. I'm a fan of alternative interpretations of stories because I think it's interesting to look at things from multiple perspectives. But let's not overstate the point here. This is, in the end, a fan theory about a cartoon. I would hate for someone to interpret this as some Draco and leather pants nonsense about how Rameses was a small innocent being who was blameless until big mean God made him do bad things. Ooh woo. Whether you consider God to have interfered directly with Rameses' decision-making or not, Rameses was still an active participant in the suffering and enslavement of the Hebrews until at least this specific moment, and his disregard of their suffering because they were just slaves was entirely him, no higher power interference necessary. Also, just to spell it out for you, I don't actually think that the Prince of Egypt meant to portray any of this as what's actually happening. This is just like one of those fan theory pages on TV tropes where people imagine alternate explanations for things while knowing and acknowledging full well that they're just sharing headcanons. That said, looking at the movie from this perspective makes me think harder about all the things DreamWorks changed in their adaptation, and why those changes were made. Most of them were just for streamlining the story, sure, but I can't stop thinking about the specific decision to remove or at least hide the multiple times that the book explicitly says God was the one making Pharaoh keep the Hebrews enslaved while the plagues were busy ravaging Egypt. The only time this is even obliquely referred to in the movie is during the plagues, when Rameses is doubling down on keeping the Hebrews enslaved regardless of the consequences. But even here, it's in the passive voice. Then let my heart be hardened. Then let my heart be hardened. It's not, then my heart I'll keep hardened, or even, then my heart will be hardened, which at least imply that Rameses himself was responsible for hardening his heart. It's the passive, let my heart be hardened, by external forces outside of my control.
All the innocent who suffer from your stubbornness and pride.
There are innocents suffering because of stubbornness and pride, but not because of his. Because of his. The use of this line in the plagues makes it clear that the creators were definitely aware of God's hand in Pharaoh's callousness, but they presumably didn't want to complicate the story by adding a plot line that could have painted God as, at best, morally questionable, at least as far as this specific story goes. It's easier to just paint Rameses as the unambiguous villain, evil and obstinate for his own sake, refusing to listen to reason because he has daddy issues, instead of because he literally has no say in the matter. In this portrayal of Rameses as the willing and able villain, he's shown telling Moses that he intends to again purge the Hebrews just as his father did, perhaps going even further than Seti himself. Finishing the job could easily be read as an intention to exterminate them entirely. This sequence ends with Rameses saying this chilling line.
And there shall be a great cry in all of Egypt, such as never has been or ever will be again.
Whew! I mean, that's pretty intense, right? Maybe the kind of thing a supervillain would say before killing a ton of innocent people, so the heroes and the viewers can know for sure that he's unambiguously the villain of the story. It does seem pretty on the nose as something that definitely no good person would have any reason to say before doing a bunch of murders, right? Yeah. In the Bible, that's God's line, and he says it in reference to the incoming 10th plague where he killed all the firstborn of Egypt, from the pharaoh's son to the firstborn of the maidservant behind the mill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. Look, I get it. It's a kind of poetic irony. Pharaoh orders the killing of all the male children of the Hebrews, so God kills all of Egypt's firstborn. It doesn't specifically say that it's the firstborn's sons, but still, the parallel is obvious and deliberate. Gollum kills Deagle because of his lust for the ring, and this lust for the ring eventually becomes his undoing. Laius orders Oedipus killed because of a prophecy that his son will kill him one day, and in doing so he actually ensures that the prophecy comes to pass. This kind of irony is a common theme in stories from all eras. Still, giving this line to the unambiguous villain in your story means that, at the very least, the people behind that decision were aware of how villainous, how evil it sounded. There are countless examples in the book of God doing some stuff that at least seems pretty evil, in Exodus and beyond. If you choose to take that interpretation of events through to the movie adaptation, the ending of The Prince of Egypt is still uplifting for the Hebrews, who've managed to escape slavery and servitude to find their freedom outside of Egypt. But it's tragic for Rameses, who has to spend the rest of his days in a ruined kingdom, never able to reconcile with his brother, whose god ruined his kingdom and killed his son. But hey, that's just a theory.